Hey everybody, Brian from the Cabinet Joint here. Today we're talking about the mixer lift out mechanism for your KitchenAid mixer appliance. The reason these are getting so popular, they really kind of have been for a while, is mixers, the big ones like the KitchenAid that are 19 inches high, do not fit underneath your wall to countertop typically, so people are putting them in their base cabinets. So here we have one that's going in an inset cabinet. We'll get into this in a minute when we talk about this panel on the inset side. If you have inset, this is going to be a little more complicated than if it was overlay. So all I can really tell you about this unit before we get into the assembly or the installation is it cannot go in a cabinet that has a drawer above. It has to be a full door cabinet. The reason is when I pull this out like this, it swings down and barely clears the cabinet floor as it is, and then comes up into place, and my mixer will sit here. If you had a drawer here, first of all, it's going to collide with the bottom, and I can't fit my mixer in there, and the mixer is going to sit way down here instead of up high where I want it at counter level. Must go in a full door cabinet. The other piece of information I'll give you is you want to make sure that your cabinet, if it's an inset cabinet, you want to use at least a 21-inch wide cabinet because you're losing a bunch of space right here because of that panel. So on inset, minimum of a 21-inch cabinet. Now, I would really say any cabinet, even overlay. Overlay, you'd gain about 1.5 inches here, but it's still only a 12 5/8 wide, I think, shelf. So not a lot of room. So I would say if you got a big old mixer, you're gonna want a 21-inch cabinet or bigger. Please don't go smaller or you might be yelling at us that this shelf is almost unusably small. Okay, other than that, like I said, a lot of dimensions and drilling to do on this one. So let's get started, show you how it goes in. Okay, before we get started, let's talk about what comes with the unit and the tools you're gonna need. You're going to get a set of instructions, pretty easy to follow, I found, except for some of the missing things I'll talk about in a minute. You're going to get the left and right brackets itself. So this is going to sit as your left one. There's your pull handle to pull it and bring your lifter up. So you have your mixer up. So you have a left one and a right one. I've already got the right one installed. We'll talk about that in a moment. You're going to get 2 packs of screws. They look identical. They're not. One is 5/8 inch long. The other pack has 1/2 inch long. The 5/8 inch ones are the ones you use to mount the mixer bracket or carriage to the sidewall. The other ones are used to mount the actual shelf through the bottom of the lift out to mount the shelf that your mixer will sit on. They only have to be 1/2 inch because they're not in shear. So 2 packs of screws, some 5/8, some 1/2 inch. Gonna need a pencil, a lot of marking going on here. Gonna need a drill with a Phillips bit, and you're gonna need a bit for a drill bit of 3/32 of an inch. You can use one drill for both if you don't have 2 like I've got here, but you're gonna need a 3/32 drill bit for pre-drilling and a Phillips head. You're gonna need a level, and then you'll see these pieces of plywood. These do not come with the cabinet, so you're gonna have, and they don't come with the mixer lift either. You're gonna need to either supply these, run to Lowe's or Home Depot, or talk to your sales rep about getting some pre-cut pieces for you. But what we're using here is 6-inch high, 3/4 thick plywood. Aside from that, pretty straightforward. Oh, of course, tape measure. Aside from that, pretty straightforward list of tools and materials. Okay guys, let's get into the installation of this mixer lift, pull out or lift out. A couple of things I want to make a note about. This is an inset application. These units will work in inset or overlay. If it's overlay, you're going to follow what I'm going to do on this left-hand side on both sides. On inset, we have the hinge bracket that hangs into the opening as well as the door, and we've got to clear that. So instead of doing 3/4 plywood, you've either got to boost this out by 2.5 inches or so, or just use a vertical panel. So your sales rep should order you, or you can rob from the job and grab a shelf from a different cabinet and then we'll send you a new shelf. But we want to use a piece of banded plywood finished because that's going to act as our vertical support for this right-hand mechanism. Also remember that on inset, the more you come in, the more it closes down the width of the mixer lift out. So to give you an idea on this particular cabinet, it is a 21-inch cabinet basically because we have an extended style there. It's a 21-inch cabinet, and this can only fit, that when I measured it earlier, it was like a 13.5-inch wide shelf in there for the mixer. So it's not giving you, once I install this one and I measure from there to the other bracket, 13.5 is not an awful lot of width. So meaning you can't take an 18-inch cabinet on an inset application and fit a mixer lift out. Your shelf is going to be that wide. So think in terms of how much space do I really have, and work with your cabinet coach on that. But what I want to get into now is an overview, and then I'll show you how we do it on this left-hand side. So what the instructions call for is you're going to measure down from the top of the cabinet, not here, but here. You're going to measure down 4.5 inches, and strike a line or a dot 4.5 inches down and 2 inches back from the front frame. In the case of inset, it's 2 3/4 of an inch back because you're trying to account for the thickness of this door, so you're stepping back an extra 3/4 of an inch. So 4.5 down from the top of the cabinet, 2 inches back if it's overlay, 2 3/4 back if it's inset. Make a dot and pre-drill a little hole. That's for this screw on this slotted part. Then you're gonna level the unit. Take your level you're gonna need for your tools. You're gonna need a level. We're gonna level the unit and then put our next screw in the slot back here. So if you look at this other unit, this other mechanism for this side of the cabinet, we're talking about that screw and that screw. So if we lock it in place with those two screws, it gives us some ability to adjust, okay? So the two slotted screws is what we're trying to get to. Once we know this level, the unit is level, and we lock those two screws in, we're going to install the second unit. We're not going to put all these other screws in that I did yet, because we want the ability to move the unit up and down to get the shelf level this way. So I'm going to use this unit as the one that I level. So I can go up and down with this one until I get my shelf level. So on the inset, you're not going to be able to grab this front row of shelf holes or holes when you go to install. And here's the reason why. This is why I'm glad we're shooting this video for you, because you wouldn't think this through as a homeowner unless you're really on top of things. You need to be able to get to your adjustment screws on your inset hinge to get your left, right, up, down, in, out adjustments. So I've got to keep this panel stepped back enough that I can get a screwdriver on all three of these screws. And I got to keep it this way enough that I can still get my finger back there and pop the door off. Okay, if I can't snap that door off, I can't get the door off if I have an issue like I got to replace it or whatever. And because this panel is screwed on from underneath, up here, and through the back, you can't get to the screws once the cabinet is installed. So I want to just quickly talk about this panel for your inset, folks. We have it set, well, I am 2 3/4 back to the front of it from the front of the cabinet, and I am 2 3/4 from the side of the cabinet to here. This is on inset. From here to here. Top, bottom, front and back. Strike a line and install it with a screw through the top, screw through the bottom, screw through that back spreader strip, and screw through the back if you so choose. That keeps the panel nice and straight, keeps it from tipping or falling away. If you go any tighter to the cabinet wall in here, you will not be able to release the cabinet door with this mechanism. You won't be able to get the cabinet door out. So gotta keep that in mind. I can't come any more further forward or I'm going to cover those screws. So even though the directions say 2 3/4 back from the front is my first screw, you'll notice I couldn't do that. I had to step it back in even further to get some meat here, and this row of screw holes becomes unusable. So follow what I'm saying. You have to deviate from inset a little bit unless you're using like standard unadjustable finial style hinges. With these arms on these bloom hinges, they throw back inside the cabinet so far. You've got to follow my lead here and step that cabinet. The front of this panel is at 2 3/4, and you can only use the back row of holes, okay? So hopefully that's making sense. So that's how the installed one on the right side will look. Now I'm going to spin this way, and what you should see here, another tool you're going to need or a piece of supplies, is a piece of plywood 6 inches high by the depth of the inside of the cabinet. Now, in the instructions, they tell you to take this piece of plywood and shove it right to the cabinet top, and that should be enough. But what they're not telling you they tell you in the instructions, but what they're not very clear with, except a note at the bottom, is they're sizing this as if it's a 16.5 inch high mixer. And from my recollection, a lot of the KitchenAid style, the big mixers are more like 19 inches high, which is why this mixer lift out exists in the first place, is they can't fit them on the countertop because it won't clear the 18-inch gap between the counter and the bottom of your wall cabinet, hence the need to put it in a base cabinet. So if you have a 19.5 inch high mixer, you're gonna have to come down a little bit further with your block by a couple of inches, and I'll show you how that works out. Remember the 4.5 inches from the top? And I told you I came down like 7.5 or 8 for that mixer? Critical. So you can see here, I don't have it shoved all the way to the top. I've got it down a few inches. Same deal, I measured down from the top of the cabinet. Normally it's 4.5, I came down 7 3/4 it looks like. I came way down here and I struck a line. That's where my thing is gonna mount here. I'm gonna step back the distance I need to match this one, put my first screw in, level the unit, put the back one in. So let's show you how that works as I do this, gonna be a little tough as I'm in the way of the workspace, but I'll do the best I can to stay out of the way while I work. Okay, let's get going. Okay, so we're gonna work on the left-hand side as if it's overlay. And again, insets, you got that panel thing to contend with. Again, I came down more with my block versus keeping it all the way up because I have a deeper mixer. I set it so that I still can pull the mixer out without the carriage hitting the bottom of the cabinet. So you don't want to go so low that the mixer scrapes the bottom of the cabinet. But what I did is I'm down, I gave you some dimensions earlier, I want to give the exact ones. I am down 6 3/4 to my first hole, okay? That's the middle of my slotted hole. And then I have a level line going back. It's 9.5 inches, or just a little less than 9.5 inches between the holes. That was my second mark. I held my bracket up in here to make sure. So I have a center hole there, and I got one on the other side, so that's where I'll lock it in a moment. To review the dimensions once again, if you're overlay, you don't need to step it back as far as I did. Your first hole would be 2 inches back. So you'd be in here with your first hole, and that way you'll have this whole block to work with. You can get all your screws in. That inset one, I'm stepping the whole thing, left and right. I'm stepping it back further than the instructions call for because of this inset situation I have on the right-hand side. Well, let's pretend you're doing overlay. You're gonna be 2 inches back. I'm further than that because of my inset situation. So I got my level line, I got my holes. I'm gonna pre-drill. So I got a 3/32 drill bit. I'm gonna pop a quick hole there. And there. And I don't want to go too far. I don't want to blow all the way through the cabinet. These screws are only 5/8 of an inch long. Now I'm going to get my Phillips head. I'm going to line up my first hole in the center of that front slot. And it can float around, it doesn't matter. You're going to lock it in later. Now I'm going to get my second hole here. Lined up in the slot, and there it is. Okay, so now my carriage is locked in. Remember I told you I have this one fixed. I don't want to fix this one in place until I have my level determined. So I can take a little torpedo level, or I can pull both of these out and I can level it up here, but I want to not lock this one all the way in until I'm sure both these units and my actual top, my shelf that's going to hold the mixer, are dead level. So I'm going to work on that now. We'll come back and show you what we did. Okay, so to recap, I had my 2 slotted screws in. I pulled this mechanism up till it locked in place. I put a level on here, and I want to get level left to right. And so I raised the front door back until I got it where I wanted it, and then I put another lock screw on both sides. You can see I got a second screw front, second screw back. That kind of locks it in place. And now I can go put the rest of my screws in and put the shelf in. Now, one thing I want to make a comment on at this point, we don't have the mixer here. This is going to the customer's house. The way this unit comes, there's 3 settings for light, medium, and heavy weight mixers. Picture a KitchenAid, they're very heavy. That would be the heavier setting, I'm guessing. This comes from the factory set in the middle. You need a 10mm wrench, and basically, Mr. Cameraman, if you can come around here real quick, right here, you would loosen this screw. And this screw, there's a hole here, a hole that it's in, and a high hole, and you would manipulate this to make it heavier. It's in the middle one, lighter, heavier, or keep it where it is. I don't have the mixer here, so I'm going to leave it medium, but be aware that if you change that, either the high hole or the low hole, it does change the pitch of the unit. So the homeowner may have to play with these screws. I don't think they will, but if their mixer is very light or very heavy, it might mean that when they pull this thing up, the mixer isn't quite sitting level, because those holes will drive level a little bit different. Much easier to put this in if you have the mixer handy. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm gonna put these 2 down, and you can see how I'm doing that. I'm just grabbing this handle, pulling it forward, and just running it down. Now, what we're gonna do now is take a dimension between those 2 arms that go down and cut my shelf to size. Now, the shelf does not come with the mixer, but every time you order one of these base full door cabinets from us, you're going to get 2 shelves. So you can use one of those two shelves to cut to size. As you can see, I got mine over here. It's going to come as if it's a real shelf, so it's sized to fit inside the cabinet. We're not going to use it as a shelf. We're going to cut it down width and depth to fit between here and use as our shelf. We'll have a nice banded edge. You will not have any banding on the edge of the shelf, so when you pull this thing up, you're going to see that. The reason I bring this up is what you'll see a lot of folks do is they'll order like a block of walnut, 1 inch thick, nice eased edge all the way around, finished in a natural. And that becomes the shelf. So when you pull this up, you've got a nice walnut or maple or whatever wood you want, a nice finished solid wood shelf versus plywood where we're gonna have that raw edge on the side. I'm gonna go ahead and send this as is. If the homeowner wants to order a shelf from our sales rep, we can always send them one. They can just swap it out. It's very easy to do. But I'm gonna use this plywood shelf, cut it to size, and show you how that goes in. Okay, so the way the instructions call to size your shelf widthwise to clear all this apparatus is you take a dimension from this surface to this surface, these brackets that poke out from that flat surface over, and I get 13 7/8 from here to here, 13 7/8. Then you back off 1 1/4 inches, okay, total. So that gets me to 12 5/8. So I'm gonna do 12 5/8, and that extra 1 1/4 inches, what it's doing is factoring in all this apparatus here on both sides. So I'm going to take my shelf, keeping my edge banded as the front, that's my front, I'm going to measure 12 5/8 and I'm going to cut my shelf depth-wise. So I'll come back after I've made that cut. Okay, so to install the shelf, what we're going to do, there's 3 slotted holes on both arms, and then a whole bunch of individual holes you can use to lock it in later, but we're worried about the slotted ones right now because that still allows us to push and pull these 2 brackets to get us clearance down below. So to find the locations of those 3, they want you to come 8.5 inches from the front of the shelf, and then every 3 inches after that. So 8.5, 11.5, so on and so forth, both sides. The distance from the edge is 1 3/16 to each of these holes, okay? You can double check before you do any pre-drilling by laying this up top and making sure you see your marks underneath, which I did. So now what I'm gonna do is take my 3/32 drill bit. Okay, quick little hole in each one. Remember these holes, or these screws are only, these ones are only 1/2 inch long. So we don't gotta go way in. We're just trying to give the screw something to bite into. All right, now with my finished edge forward, I'm gonna lay this up here. Now I'm gonna grab my Phillips head bit with my 4-inch or my 1/2 inch screws. And working underneath, I'm gonna find my first hole in the center. And what I'm doing is lining the hole up with the center of that slot by pulling the bracket in if necessary. Okay. That's going to hold it in place for a moment. I'm going to grab my handles and we're going to push this down, and what we want to make sure is nothing collides. I don't want to have any rubbing, no rubbing here or at the bracket at the back. I want everything to clear nice. And while it does clear, I'm a little kicked, okay? If you look down here, you can see I'm a little twisted. So I want to make sure my shelf is straight. So now I can put my second set of screws in. Oops, where's the... I'm gonna make sure my shelf is straight by putting my second hole or second screw in the front slot. That one's nice and straight. And that one's nowhere near straight. I'm gonna take that one until I get it straight along here. And lock it in. Okay, to summarize, I've got 3 screws in each of these 2 plenums underneath here, these flat areas. What I have to do is make sure the flat edge of my shelf is lined up with the flat edge of this. If you have the shelf inboard so you can see some of that rolled edge of this bracket here, that's going to push the 2 pull-out brackets further apart and potentially cause a rub. So if you've measured using that 1 1/4 inch less than the width of the brackets, you want to have these lined up perfectly. And now what happens when I lock both of those in, now what happens is when I push this down, I get no rubbing or bumping, not even close. It goes in nice and straight, nice and quiet, clears everything. I release it, and now my mixer can sit up here nice and steady. I also took some time just to sand these edges down. Might even put some clear coat on there for the customer. But again, I really think this would look better with a nice walnut shelf or a good inch thick block of hard maple, something like that. So now all I have to do is on these bottom edges of this bracket, there's a whole series. I'll tip this back so you can see. There's a whole series of holes, and I'm going to take the rest of my screws and put them in the holes, not the slots. Now that I've used the slots to determine where I want it to be, I'm going to put 3 screws in each one of these holes here just to hold the shelf in place so it doesn't slide around. So I'll go ahead and do that, and I think we're about wrapped up, and we'll take you through the final parts of the install. Okay, that wraps up our installation of the mixer lift out. Just to reiterate, I went through and made sure I had screws in all my holes, made sure my shelf was in there nice and straight, made sure when I pull it down, the bottoms here don't scrape the bottom of the cabinet. I'm about a ½ inch above that. Remember, I wanted to give as much space to the customer as I can for as tall a mixer as they could possibly need. And then when this came up, I wanted to make sure nothing bound, and I made sure I had all my screws in here. I got 6 screws on both sides, and everything goes in without any issue. And the door shuts without getting in the way. So that's your mixer lift out install. If you have any questions, give your cabinet coach a call, 888-211-6482. We hope this helps you guys out. It's a lot of dimensions on this one, a lot of pencil marks and drilling, but it's really not that bad of an install. Thanks for watching.